if you have questions about the film for our speakers or about the current conditions in the restaurant industry, which is what we're going to start off with, please put that in the chat and we will do our best to answer these questions. And I just am going to start by asking myself the one question that everybody asks me, and then we'll be done with me. The question everybody asks me is, why did I make this film? And the answer to that is because when I first heard Saru speak about the issue of the tip minimum wage at a luncheon where she spoke for about 10 minutes, I almost fell off my chair when I heard that it was $2.13 an hour. Even though it's not $2.13 an hour in California, in many states it still is. And I was so shocked and thought that if I didn't know this, how many other thousands or millions of people across the country wouldn't know it? And essentially the film became a journey to educate myself and to educate others about the tip minimum wage. And that's why we are anxious for those of you who saw the film tonight to share the film with other people as we move forward from here, and to share what you've now learned about the tip minimum wage. And our discussion is going to focus on what we all can do about it. So I want to kick off tonight by asking Saru, there has been a tremendous amount of activity since the pandemic and around issues that One Fair Wage has been fighting for all along. So Saru, my question is, maybe starting with the most recent activities, including some strikes in New York and Chicago, take us up to the current day around where things are with the fight to end the tip minimum wage, and then we'll move on and ask some other questions. You have to unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to everybody who saw the film tonight. We're really appreciative. And of course, thank you as always to Abby for making the film, to get the word out about these issues, and to Women Making Movies for hosting this screening and event. Actually, is it possible to share my screen, Kendra? Because I'd love to share some of the images from the strikes that Abby just talked about. So maybe let me know that while I get started.
Just talk for it, so we don't lose. We don't want to screw up our beginning Q&A by doing a screen share we can't make happen.
I'm sure I can do it because I did it 5 minutes ago. But if you give me host capabilities, oh, there we go. I got it. So I just want to share that the pandemic, you all saw the film and saw what we were fighting for prior to the pandemic and why we were fighting for those things. The fact that the subminimum wage has been a legacy of slavery and a source of both sexual harassment and racial discrimination for 150 years. And I will say one kind of evolution in the way I've been thinking about it, especially given the murder of George Floyd and the new book that's come out by Isabel Wilkerson on caste. I don't know how many people have seen or read that book, but there's no greater example of the caste system, the racial caste system in the United States, than the subminimum wage, because truly the $2 wage in America is a valuing of people's worth, of women's worth, and in particular, women of color's worth. It is a value placed on women of color. And that was true prior to the pandemic. With the pandemic, what was horrible, outrageous, unjust, a caste system became a matter of life and death, because since March 13th, which was D-Day in our industry, 10 million restaurant workers have lost their jobs, and 60% of those workers were unable to access unemployment insurance because of the subminimum wage for tipped workers in many states, including, you saw the fight in Michigan, when Jane Fonda talked about it. You saw the fight in DC. In those same states where legislatures reversed workers' wages from what the people said it should be down to back to 2 and 3, those same states after the pandemic or during the pandemic turned around and told those same workers whose wages they reversed back, you earn too little to qualify for benefits. So that is why the majority of workers didn't get unemployment insurance, not because they were undocumented. I'm actually talking mostly about citizens. They were told you earn too little, which was the fault of the very same legislatures and states telling them that. So it was an outrageous situation. It led to massive destitution among a huge, immense, the largest workforce in America. And then workers started to be called back to work still for a sub minimum wage when tips are down 50 to 75% right now across the country. And, we keep emphasizing, I just want you to keep in mind where there is either outdoor or indoor dining, these workers who earn 2 and 3 or 5, whatever the sub minimum wage is in their state, they're being asked to enforce social distancing and mask wearing from the very same customers from whom they're supposed to get tips to complement their wages to bring them to a full minimum wage. They are being harassed like crazy. And maybe some of you have seen some of the news clips of people, servers getting beaten up, servers getting screamed at, all kinds of racial and gender epithets. One woman was told, "You'd be a lot cuter if you took off the mask. I'd give you a bigger tip." So sexual harassment and racial harassment have fused with safety harassment. And all of this for a sub minimum wage. Workers are putting up with so much more, and their wages remain at $2 and $3 and $12 an hour. And it has led to workers saying enough is enough. Enough is enough, and going on strike. And it has led to employers in the hundreds coming to us, some of whom in Washington, D.C., who fought us on this issue, coming to us and saying, we agree with you. It's time to move to one fair wage. Many employers in D.C. are right now paying one fair wage, those who fought this, because they have no choice, because workers are saying, that's it, I'm done. If you're asking me to risk my life and my family's life for a sub minimum wage when tips are down 75% and enforce these safety protocols from the very same customers from whom I'm supposed to get tips, I'm done. And that is why they went on strike. And I told Nikki earlier, I just feel so moved to share a very, very quick video from our Chicago strike. It's a 1-minute video of one of these workers who said the most powerful things that every time I see it, it makes me cry. This is Kimani in Chicago.
Postmates, so I don't get paid the full minimum wage working for Postmates. Sometimes I don't even make $1 on a good day. So I also work for another restaurant, and I only got paid $6. A plate of curry goat with rice costs $14. $14. Are you saying I'm not worth $14, $15 an hour? I'm not worth the minimum wage?
We can't hear the sound, Saru.
So let's just come back. We got it. We're not, let's come back as the whole, yeah, we're not hearing it. Now I've lost you. So you're on mute.
Yeah, I was on mute. I tried to put my voice on mute and maybe I cut off Kimani. But I can finish.
So talk about what happened in Chicago and New York, because it didn't, people on the chat may not know exactly what happened.
Yeah, I think that, people might think this is the hardest time for workers to go on strike, the hardest time for employers to raise wages, but our experience, and Nikki can talk about this, is frankly exactly the opposite, that workers have reached that point of just being fed up, that they're not going to put up with it anymore. Yes, they are at their wits' ends. They are, in many cases, homeless, living in parks, facing starvation. We started a relief fund for these 10 million workers. We raised $23 million. 220,000 workers applied. The money's almost all but gone. We're still raising more and more. But 6 months ago, when we started the fund, the workers said, this is great because I needed to feed my children. Now they're saying, I'm having to steal food for my children. I don't have money for gas to get to the food bank. I have no choices. And, perhaps in a capitalist mind, that results in workers being willing to take any job that comes their way. And people should know that was the design and the intention of the system of unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance, like the sub-minimum wage, was set up to force people during the 30s to take any job that came their way, because you give them a little bit of benefits and you say, we will take this away unless you take any job that comes your way. But what we are seeing is that workers, in making that decision, take any job that comes your way or you'll lose your benefits, or expose yourself to the virus for a $2 wage with no tips. They're actually choosing nothing. They're saying, no, I refuse to go back, even if it means I'll lose my benefits, even if it means I don't have a way to feed my family. I don't have a way to feed my family now anyway. So I think that there's something counterintuitive happening. Workers are rising up. Strikes happen in New York and Chicago, August 31st. They're happening in 2 more cities, September 30th, and Nikki can tell you how it's going to grow from there. On the employer side, it might seem counterintuitive. Why would employers say, I think it's time to raise wages at a time when a lot of them are closing? Well, a lot of employers are saying this is precisely the time to change the system. A lot of employers were moved by watching, not chains, but independent restaurants were moved by seeing their employees struggle. And a lot of employers were moved by the murder of George Floyd and the recognition that it's time, the time has come for the restaurant industry to address the legacy of slavery and systematic structural racism in our industry. And so we've had literally hundreds of restaurants in DC, in New York, in Massachusetts, in Chicago, come to us and say, we think it's time to change. We want to switch to a full minimum wage, a different model. And they're actually coming with us to state legislatures and governors and saying we all should reopen with a new system. Let's make it a level playing field. Let's reopen differently. If we're going to reopen at all, let's reopen and do it right this time. This pandemic has forced a lot of them to kind of rethink the entire business model.
Okay, so Nikki, can you pick up where sort of Saru left off and talk a little bit about specific campaigns? I mean, we know there's Massachusetts, there's Illinois, there's New York. Chiedza, we just lost you, but Nikki, will you give it a shot and try to tell us a little bit, give us a little bit of the lay of the land where there are real struggles going on?
Well, there are struggles happening all across the United States. Fortunately, we're able to mobilize workers and work with elected officials and community and labor allies in a couple of key battleground places where Saru mentioned some of them. We're working in New York, in Boston, in Pennsylvania, in Washington, D.C., also in Michigan, in Illinois, and Orlando. And we are also, in working in New Jersey and trying to build power in North Carolina as well. But we have people from all across the country who've applied to our emergency fund in all states who are struggling. But just a little bit more to answer your question, what's happening in some of the states, I'll give a quick overview. So and I'll land in Washington, D.C., since that's where the film was. In New York, we have an opportunity to win one fair wage this year. Governor Cuomo just has to sign an executive order. There's a ton of evidence. There's been continual pressure from workers and employers. As Sarah was talking, independent employers. We've struck a unity deal. We're going on strike. We're just repeatedly trying to tell him and other legislators that one fair wage was needed before, and it is definitely needed right now amongst COVID. So if you live in New York and you're watching, please call Governor Cuomo's office and tell him that he can pass one fair wage right now, pass an executive order, sign an executive order. And it's really, really needed, especially in New York, like right now, because they're about to reopen indoor dining. And the governor's also proposing to have a special police force, make sure that people are wearing masks in there. And so that's an issue that we want to prevent. So that's happening in New York. In Pennsylvania, we're really working to turn out the vote there. In order to win one fair wage legislatively, we've got to make sure we've got the right people in office. So we're turning people out to vote in that state. And we've got a bill that we'll be pushing in the spring. In Orlando, same thing. We're really building power to mobilize voters there, low-wage workers who've applied to our fund. It also happens to be the home of many national Restaurant Association corporate headquarters. So we are planning to strike there. Workers are going to be striking there. And it's similar in the other places in Chicago or in the state of Illinois and Detroit. We're really just organizing people to get ready to advocate for legislation. In Washington, D.C., it's a pretty interesting scenario. Y'all saw after the film, the DC City Council overturned our vote that they thought the fight would be over, but it actually enraged people so much, whether they supported the initial ballot initiative or not. A lot of people definitely support it now because they're infuriated that their vote was nullified. So we have some really outstanding people who are running for office right now in DC who are championing this issue. And we're going to be reintroducing that legislation with their support at the top of the year. And we're excited to win it once and for all. So like Saru said, we've got a lot of employers who once opposed it, who are now coming out and advocating for it because they see structurally how the sub-minimum wage is screwing over the people that sustain their business.
And I love to share because Nikki did such an amazing job with the strikes. I just want to share, this is Times Square. We had a 24-foot Elena, the essential worker, who's the new Rosie the Riveter.
She's over here on the right of the screen as you're looking at it. So she's a cardboard cutout. Is that what she is?
No, she's a huge wooden statue.
Oh, okay. I thought she was a cardboard. I thought she looked like an Obama, cutout. Okay.
Yeah, and so workers were on strike in both New York and Chicago with Elena, the essential worker, standing with them.
Okay, so let me just say something. And there was a question about what is the tip minimum wage in Colorado. You can, depending on what states you're from, I literally Googled it while somebody else was talking. You can Google what is the tip minimum wage, fill in the blank, in Delaware, in New York, whatever, and find it out. The point about knowing what it is it tells you how much money a worker has to take out of their tips just to make minimum wage in their state. So we'll take the example of Colorado. If it's $8.98 in Colorado and the normal minimum wage in Colorado is $12, that means that $3.02 of every, once an hour, a worker has to take that from their tips just to add it to the minimum wage, just to get to minimum wage. That's sort of the point. And this movement is asking for, and demanding essentially that employers pay whatever the state minimum wage is plus tips. And actually, now that we're moving towards a demand for a living wage across the country, really the demand is for $15 plus tips. But it'll be a while in some of these states before the minimum wage in the state is $15. But it would be a step up even in the 725 states. If workers were paid $7.25 instead of $2.15, it would mean they were making $5 more an hour, assuming under a good circumstance that their tips stay stable. Okay, Chiedza, why don't you talk about some of the issues that the film brought up for you or resonated for you that were in the film that you think need underscoring?
I feel like the reality of being dependent on other people's biases for your income is in a lot of ways unconscionable, because here you have people who are providing a service, who are trying to do the best job that they can, and based on their skin color, based on their gender, based on how rich or how poor or how quote unquote cultured they get interpreted as, is going to dictate whether or not they're going to be able to pay their rent, going to dictate on whether or not they're going to be able to pay their bills, feed their kids, fundamentally. And the concept that you can have a job where you are literally, your job is to make people happy, and those people's biases are going to influence how much you're monetarily quote unquote worth. And so you're selling yourself essentially. And in that transaction, they decide how much is what you are providing worth. And when I think about, I totally resonate with what Saru was talking about, because now in terms of the pandemic, you have servers being put in a position where they need to enforce masks, enforce social distancing. And now all of a sudden you have this stratification where you're a disciplinarian and a server, both.
Yeah.
And so you're a disciplinarian, you're a server, and you're risking your life for $2 an hour. Like, that concept is so egregious to me. And personally, one of my very best friends, who's a restaurant owner in San Francisco, she had gotten money from the PPP to pay her servers. And you know what she did? She paid them $26 an hour, because she knew that based on what the tips were before, that's what her servers needed to live on if they lived in San Francisco. So it wasn't about what is the San Francisco minimum wage. It is, what do you need to be able to pay your rent, pay your bills, be able to buy food? And that was the standard that she set. And when that money ran out, she chose to close her restaurant than to pay her workers a wage that they could not live on. She was like, I don't believe in paying people under a wage they can live on. And if that's something that I need to do, and she's now transitioned into doing food advocacy with an Eat Real organization on the board. So she's like, okay, well, if my restaurant is not able to make sure that I can take care of my workers and have them supported in the way that they need to, then they need to be able to get unemployment. They need to be able to get unemployment, and they need to be able to at least sustain themselves. And the fact that that option, that thought, is not in the minds of the people who are having these restaurants and these sub minimum wages, that they are sending these people to risk their lives for $5, $2, $3, $8. And we see across the board, in terms of takeout, in terms of counter service, people do not tip the same. They just don't.
Right.
Table service, if it's sit down table service, people, will tip 20%, 15%. But you go to a takeout counter, maybe you'll leave $1. Maybe you'll leave $5 if you feel nice. So if you're ordering food for your whole family, and it's an expensive restaurant, and you just threw down, $80 to feed your whole family, and you leave $2, $3, $5,
yeah,
and that worker is only making $2 an hour, where is that worker in the situation that they're being put in? And that's kind of where I see things are at right now in terms of the pandemic and service industry. And it needs to change. It fundamentally needs to change.
And let me say, I think that's, that was part of the motivation for us to try to share this film this week. This is something, it's like, once you learn it, as Saru says about other things, there's no going back. Once you know how screwed up this system is, it means that the next time you order food, or you are in a restaurant, or, you're in any way dealing with people who are tipped restaurant workers, it is my belief you will behave differently, because you will understand the situation in a way that you may not have before we had this conversation and you saw the film. So, I'm with you that this is part of a game plan to really, use all of us as educators among our friends and our family and other people that we come in contact with, to say, did you know? Did you really know this? This is like outrageous. And maybe, we talk about it in the film as a legacy of slavery. That becomes a really important thing for people to know as well. That we come out of slavery thinking, well, the people who are serving on, Pullman trains or elsewhere, they're freed slaves and they don't deserve a wage at all. So we haven't come very far since, 1865. And it's time for us to sort of band together and do something about this. Okay, let me ask you this, Saru, if you could talk a little bit about, I want you just to mention the fact that in New York, what the governor did and didn't do, that he managed to get rid of the tip minimum wage for everybody but restaurant workers. So I don't know how many people are listening who are from New York, but New York is sort of at a tipping point, so to speak. And we want your help in getting Cuomo to do the right thing. So just give us a situation of where things are in New York and what people can do.
Yeah, there's so much hope right now, really. There's so much hope for change in New York in particular, but I think Nikki should also talk about DC because there's so much hope for change in DC, which I hope will be uplifting after the disappointing, news of DC in the film. So I'd love to talk about New York. I want Nikki to talk about DC, but in New York, we back in 2017, Me Too erupted. We had been lifting up the stories of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry because of the sub minimum wage for a long time. Governor Cuomo, at the tail end of 2017, was asked by a female reporter at a press conference, "What are you going to do about sexual harassment in the legislature?" And he yelled at the reporter and said, "What are you going to do about, sexual harassment in the media? And it's in every industry, not just the legislature." And he was very bad. It was a bad moment for him. So we immediately emailed and said, "Hey, we've got a way you can address sexual harassment and improve your situation right now." And it was good timing. So then like 2 days later, they called us and said, "We're going to move forward with, looking at enacting one fair wage as executive action in New York," which he has the power to do. That was end of 2017. There were hearings across the state that he held on the issue in 2018. And then he did nothing on the issue because of pressure from the Restaurant Association from June 2018 until New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2019, when he finally announced, "We're going to do one fair wage for everybody, all tipped workers, except restaurant workers," which I don't know if there's any clear evidence that clearly this is the right thing to do, but the power of the Restaurant Association has meant that Democrats, let's be real who we're talking about, Democrats are cowardly, are not willing to stand up to the Restaurant Association on behalf of women and women of color. That is exactly what we're talking about. We call it the David versus Goliath fight. It's women and women of color and millions of them versus the Restaurant Association. And Governor Cuomo thus far has rolled over and said, "You know what, it's the right thing to do. I'm going to enact one fair wage, but let's just exempt the restaurant workers because the Restaurant Association doesn't like it." Now, the insanity of that was that was 2.5 months before we all shut down and New York became the hotspot for the pandemic. And restaurant workers were not only out of work, they were dying, literally dying. Because as you know, communities of color and low income communities were much harder hit than anybody by the pandemic. So right before the pandemic, everybody else got a full minimum wage. Restaurant workers were left out. And what happened to those workers who were left out? They were told by New York State, "You didn't earn enough to get unemployment insurance." They were told by New York State, the same state that told them, "We're going to give everybody else 15 except for you," they were told, "You don't get unemployment insurance." So the majority of restaurant workers didn't get unemployment insurance in New York. And as Nikki said, now he's reopening. The hopeful part of this story is that they are talking to us now. We created this unity deal between restaurant owners who want to do the right thing, who want to actually change the industry, and hundreds of workers. In a groundbreaking moment, we brought together employers for the first time with workers to say to Governor Cuomo, "You know what? We typically don't work together, but we're coming to you together to say we need restaurant relief and one fair wage." And it's made waves. The governor team has responded. And the part that's super exciting is that we worked with Mayor de Blasio in New York City to launch a program called High Road Kitchens, where we raised $3 million to give out cash grants to restaurants that commit to transitioning to one fair wage. 319 restaurants applied and said, "We're willing to transition to one fair wage." And only 100 could be afforded, but now more funding is coming in, so we might be able to support more. The point is that we were, both through our relief fund, organizing workers, and through High Road Kitchens, organizing employers. And our whole frame during the pandemic has been, let's use relief. Let's shape relief in a way that shapes the future. Let's make sure relief is conditioned on change. And that is what happened in New York City. All these restaurants became part of the program, became advocates for one fair wage. And that has pushed the governor. And we are finally in conversation about a real path forward. Now, it hasn't happened yet. So like Abby said, we need your help. We need your help. If you live in New York, or if you don't live in New York, you go to fightdon'tstarve.com. You can sign a petition to call on Governor Cuomo to enact one fair wage right now. But I think it'd be great for Nikki to share the hope in DC as well.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was like deep in this Zoom webinar chat over here.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions.
Questions. In Washington, D.C., there's a ton of hope. So we have a stellar candidate, Janice Lewis George, who's a former restaurant worker and former assistant to the Attorney General, who won against a restaurant association corporate backed candidate, blew him out of the water, is championing one fair wage. We have a general election. She won the primary. We have a general election coming where we have multiple progressive candidates who are running in support of one fair wage, and some of them are going to win. Enough so that come January, we have multiple people who are willing to reintroduce and co-sponsor this bill and make it bigger and more inclusive for folks. We're really excited for that. If you live in Washington, D.C., or dine in Washington, D.C., then there's some things you can do. You can call Kenyon McDuffie. He is the Ward 5 council member. You can also call Trayon White. He is the Ward 8 council member. I can put their information.
Put it in the chat. This is put it in the chat. Yeah.
Yes, those two gentlemen in particular need to be agitated about this issue as a racial justice issue. We think we can get them on our sides and get enough votes to actually win this once and for all. Yeah.
People have been asking, are there any, one of the questions in the chat was, is there a positive story that has happened, since I made the film? Well, I feel like both what Saru just said about New York and Nikki just said about DC are, to me, they're not individual worker stories, but we're looking for systemic change. So this is, my hat is off to One Fair Wage for the work that they're doing in spite of everything else that everybody has to do because of the pandemic, to be able to actually see if we can get some legislative change here so that, assuming our world ever goes back to something resembling normal, we're not going back to the old normal, which was horrible. And we have a new normal in which everybody has really tried to step up around the issue of One Fair Wage. So I would say that almost more than anything. There are not a lot of positive stories coming out during the pandemic for low-wage workers in any one of the categories. The stories on the front page of my paper in the New York Times are about, we're ignoring our agricultural workers who are supposed to work under extremely, densely populated situations. They pick the food that we later pay for and eat at, our dining room table, et cetera. And we're not paying any attention to the safety that they need. They're working under incredibly bad occupational health conditions. So I would say you have to think about the positive spin on all of this based on what Saru just said, and the fact that workers are willing to go out on strike and actually show some of their power at a very scary time. I was really impressed by looking at the photos that, were shared both in New York and in Chicago. So I want to say it this way. I wanted to tell the story of the tip minimum wage, but I ended up telling a story that was much bigger than that. And it was the story of really an important, labor movement, people's movement, to change something that is fundamentally part of economic inequity in this country. And as the story, so it's like, as it morphed into the story of a people's movement, and as it morphed into the story of how do we save our democracy, you begin to see how issues of economic equity affect everything that is going on in this country. And so I just want to say, I started thinking I was telling a kind of little piece of the economic story. And I felt like in the end, I was telling the story of the world as we now understand it, but maybe not all of us understood it before the pandemic. It's really a thank you to Saru and to Nikki for everything that they've been doing to keep the pressure on. And I feel like it is our job, the rest of us who are now getting educated, to join this movement in whatever way you can. It does not take a lot to write to Governor Cuomo. It does not take a lot. We can all write to the people Nikki's putting into the chat, and if you have an address of a friend in DC, use that address. But to just say, as a concerned citizen, it really matters to me that you do the right thing. And the DC Council did the wrong thing. So it's now time to correct that wrong and do the right thing. Okay, so there are more questions coming in here. Kendra is sending them to me. Okay. Okay, so this is a little bit more about the, about what's happened since the pandemic. Hang on one second. I understand the one fair wage was going to provide pandemic relief benefits to laid off restaurant workers. Can you discuss where one fair wage is with that effort? I'm a laid off bartender and signed up back in March for benefits, but never received any.
Yeah, as I said, we had 220,000 applicants. We raised $23 million. $23 million when you're handing out $500 payments. We ended up funding 35,000 workers, and we continue to fundraise, but we'll just never, ever be able to fund everybody who applied. So whoever that is, I encourage you to be in touch, because we'll continue to do our best to fund as many people as we can. But we're just not able. We would have had to have raised hundreds of millions of dollars to really fund all the people who continue to apply. And the more you fund, the more people apply. And frankly, our government should be providing the ongoing $600 a week assistance. That is the role of government, to step into moments like this. And the fact that they haven't is all the more reason why right now we need to fight. You know, our slogan is fight, don't starve. It's a slogan that actually comes from unemployed workers who are fighting during the Depression, right before the New Deal. And we need to fight. We need to fight, because even if we were to get people $500, how long does that last? A month? Less than a month? It's not, you know, it's really not, it's not a solution. The solution is to collectively fight for change, for one fair wage, for $600 in unemployment insurance, for, you know, hazard pay and paid sick leave, and all the things that we need.
And just to, not to put too fine a point on it, but just to make the point about the upcoming election, what is, so at the end of the film, where you see that the House passed one fair wage, that would not have happened in 2016. We needed the Democratic majority that we had in 2018. Nothing has happened in the Senate. I mean, even though Hakeem Jeffries says we're going to try to get the Senate to pass it, nothing has happened, because as long as Mitch McConnell is the, you know, the person at the helm, no good bills go through in that Senate. So it becomes even more important in this coming election, around issues of one fair wage and a million other issues, to think about trying to flip the Senate, because it was because the House went Democratic that the people who were really behind creating a one fair wage bill were able to kind of get it through. And there was resistance even though it passed. But we will not get the kind of uniform relief that we need in this country and the uniform change that we need until we have a Democratic Senate. Just saying. Okay, there was another question, which is, why did the filmmaker decide to make a 1 hour film? The answer to that is because it was really important to me that people have the bandwidth for a discussion. And if I had made a 1.5 hour film, that would have gone out the window. You would have been too exhausted. You would have said, I've had enough. And you would not be sitting on this Q&A right now. And I don't mean us, but I mean the people who are participants. So it was an effort to try to get the film to a length where I felt like I could give the information that I wanted and could tell the stories that I needed to tell and could kind of create an arc for the story and end it without it taking an hour and a half of people's time to watch it. And what we have done, let me just say, I mean, so that was my goal, and I felt like 60 minutes was short enough. Since we finished the film, we have chopped up a lot of 1 and 2 minute clips to try to help people, like, tell the legacy of slavery story, or to say something about sexual harassment. So there are themes in the film that lend themselves to 1 and 2 minute clips. And if anybody is interested in thinking about how to use a few of those clips, the clips are available. I will make them available to you. So if you're with an organization that thinks that this would help, you know, illuminate some issue that you're fighting for or care about, just email me at abbyginsburg@gmail.com and I will make them available. We are really trying to make this film as available as possible. And I mean, I hope people didn't feel that an hour was too long. And if you felt like it was too short, trust me, it wasn't. because a lot of what would have made it longer would not have made it better. So just bear with me on that one, and maybe it could be even shorter. We have a 10-minute version, and we have all these clips. So that was another question. Hello, we're looking at Saru's daughter up there. Hang on a second, I'm looking to see what other questions. Okay, how can legal aid attorneys who can be troops on the ground assist with improving wages in the court systems or administrative systems? That, I think what that's asking is like where you have a known case of wage theft. Is that the kind of case that a legal aid attorney could take? And I think the answer to that is yes. But why, Saru, why don't you explain why suing employers for wage theft is such a problem?
Yeah.
And why that's not how we want to go.
So the Obama administration had the highest levels of enforcement of this issue. They really tried to come down hard and make sure that restaurants complied with the rules, saying that if tips don't bring you to the full minimum wage, you have to pay the difference. And they found an 84% violation rate in the restaurants they investigated with regard to employers actually ensuring that tips make up the difference and always making up the difference and complying with the rules of the two-tiered wage system. And actually the Solicitor General of the US Department of Labor under Obama declared the issue unenforceable. She said, this is not an issue you can enforce. You have to actually change the law. And she, after that, became a very vocal advocate for one fair wage. She spoke in public hearings, in public settings, saying we actually just need to go to one fair wage. It is unenforceable, she said. So the idea that somehow the Restaurant Association, the other NRA, they love to say it's okay that people are paid $2 or $3 because the law says that employers have to make up the difference. So everybody's getting the full minimum wage. Nobody's getting $2 or $3. Well, the Obama administration said we tried to enforce that law and it was unenforceable. The vast majority of restaurants are not complying with this nationally, and there's just too many restaurants for us to go in and see, are they making up the difference in every restaurant? That's one issue. But the second issue is, even if there was 100% compliance with these rules, rather than 16% compliance, as the Obama administration found, even if there was 100% compliance, you'd still have a majority female workforce having to live mostly on tips as their wages. And we come back to what Chiesda said is the problem that still forces a very vulnerable population to put up with the highest levels of sexual harassment of any industry, now racial harassment under the Trump administration because people feel emboldened to say all kinds of crap to workers of color, and now harassment with regard to masks and everything else. So as long as workers have to get tips as a portion of their base wage, there will be the highest levels of harassment of any industry. So it cannot be about enforcement. It has to be about just paying everybody a full minimum wage. And I will say the Obama administration changed course on this. They started off not supporting one fair wage. They ended up supporting one fair wage. And now Vice President Biden and Kamala Harris have come out and endorsed one fair wage in 3 different parts of their platform: in the jobs platform, in the women's agenda, and in the racial equity agenda. And so we are mobilizing thousands of voters. Nikki should tell you more about this, but we are mobilizing thousands of low-wage restaurant worker voters to vote, saying there is a clear choice. There is one candidate who actually tried to steal your tips. President Trump, right after he was elected, tried to make tips the property of owners rather than workers. There's another candidate who's saying, I not only endorse one fair wage, I endorse it in 3 different places, in 3 different ways, and I'm committed to making it happen. So it's a clear choice for restaurant workers to vote for a raise. And even if you don't like Biden and Harris, vote yourself a raise.
Yeah. Okay, there was, all right, let me just go back to the next question. There's a question about whether there's an online group. Does One Fair Wage have any discussion groups or forums so people who actually work in the industry can communicate with each other? And if so, would one of you tell us how one accesses that?
Yes. If you are a service worker in the restaurant industry or any tip service industry or any sub minimum wage industry, please go to Service Workers United for Power. Search for this on Facebook, Service Workers United for Power. That's our national page. So you can go there, but if there's also Service Workers United for Power individual pages for New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Washington, D.C., Florida. So you can join and talk to other workers on that platform more regularly. We also have organizers on the ground in these different locations that have regular weekly meetings for people to get to know each other, talk about their issues, talk about what we want to do collectively together about these things. So I will put my contact information in the chat again. If you want to get plugged into our ongoing worker meetings, please email me and I will introduce you to our organizers.
Okay, and let's talk a little bit more about the sort of the to-do list. Because if, I don't know whether here's the question. Does One Fair Wage still need people to make calls to make sure that impacted workers know that they should be voting in Michigan and Wisconsin and some of the key swing states? Okay, so where does somebody who's got time to make some phone calls contact you?
Just email me.
Okay, so
Again.
Nikki, Nikki is nikki@onefairwage.org. You guys can remember that.
But we have a really big opportunity coming up on Tuesday where you can come and start making calls with us and Will Ferrell. Will Ferrell, the actor, is joining us for a big event on Tuesday with the Biden-Harris campaign to start making calls on Tuesday. And then you can learn on Tuesday how to sign up and continue making calls to low-wage workers. And so Tuesday, 5 Eastern, 2 Pacific, we are doing an event. SEIU President Mary Kay Henry is joining us. Will Ferrell is joining us. We've got a restaurant owner, restaurant worker, and then everybody's going to talk really briefly because then we're going to get on the phones together. Even Will is making calls too, and we're all going to call low-wage workers in Pennsylvania together. So join us Tuesday, 5 Eastern. I'll put the link to RSVP in the
definitely put the link to RSVP. Okay. And I put the link for the One Fair Wage Emergency Fund. If anybody is listening who feels, moved to want to donate to workers who have just been essentially thrown out of their jobs without any kind of lifeline, it's ofwemergencyfund.org, and they are still taking donations. So think about that. Well, I want to make a pitch for anybody who's with an organization. We got a thing in the chat saying I'm part of a documentary group. But if you are part of any kind of an organization and you want to share this film with it, feel free to contact me and we will, figure out a way to get you a copy of the film. What else? Anybody else have any other to-do items? I really want to encourage people to write to Cuomo. I think the more people he hears from, he likes the role he has created for himself in this pandemic. So he wants to be seen as the kind of white knight that he's been. Let's help him do that by doing the right thing. And that is by keeping pressure on him throughout the next few weeks.
You can also call Governor Cuomo, which would be even more impactful. Call him as many times as you possibly can and let him know that before they reopen for dining, as Nikki said, that people need to be paid. Because if we don't want New York to be another hotspot as it was, you want those workers to enforce safety protocols. I can tell you the restaurant industry, and especially indoor dining, has been named one of the top most riskiest places to catch the virus, not just for workers, but for customers. So if you want New York to not be a hotspot, you better pay those workers who are being asked to enforce these social distancing rules with the same customers they're trying to get tips from to cover their wages. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to put his phone number in the chat. If everybody can call and say, before you reopen on September 30th, please enact One Fair Wage. You can do it with a stroke of a pen.
Yes. And okay, so here is another question about a list of bad actors. Somebody wrote in the chat that Tommy Burger, place I haven't heard of, in Los Angeles, was recently found liable for wage theft and underpaying its labor force by the state, which is a good thing that they actually went after them. But the question that this person's asking is, has One Fair Wage started any kind of list of bad actors so that you know where not to go as well as where to go?
The same app has all the bad actors. You could also check out my book, Forked, where I profile both high road and low road actors and tell their stories and talk about, the differences and frankly, the problems. Like, it's not just problematic for workers that these restaurants take the low road. It's bad for the companies. They have the highest rates of turnover of any industry. And they a lot of these restaurants are cannibalizing themselves, particularly these mid-level restaurants, the IHOPs, the Denny's, the Applebee's, the Olive Gardens. You know, fast food has been exploding and fine dining has been exploding, but reflective of our hourglass economy in the United States, that middle tier is stagnating. And it's because the working class people who used to eat at those restaurants actually can no longer afford to eat at those restaurants. So when I say they're cannibalizing their own industry, they are killing themselves by not
Right.
paying their workers who used to consume in their restaurants. I mean, it's the Henry Ford rule, right? Remember Henry Ford, who started the Ford Motor Company? His rule, he wasn't a great person, but he was a smart, savvy business person. And he said, I need to pay my workers enough so they will buy these automobiles. He
Right.
had it right. How are these restaurants going to survive if the largest industry in America, which is their employees, can't afford to eat out?
Yes. Okay, I'm writing down all the Cuomo things. I'm so, okay. There was another question that just came in. Hang on a second. Does anybody know about any campaigns in Georgia? I know about North Carolina, but I actually don't know about Georgia. And I think Georgia is a tip minimum wage state. I think it's 213. I'm pretty sure it is. So there needs to be, so let me just say, for those of you who are from Georgia, there needs to be education. There needs to be activity in Georgia because you're at the bottom of the barrel. And Atlanta has a lot of restaurants and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, people think of this as a sort of foodie state. So there is work to be done. And it is fine with whoever's working on this issue if you start the work. I mean, ultimately, there's going to have to be organizing on the state level, et cetera. But it is really helpful if you start. There are two things you can do. Not only you could sort of bring the film to your documentary group or start talking about it and get other people to see it so they get educated. And they just need to know, you just send it out to people and say, Georgia's a 213 state. This film's going to tell you what you need to know. And beyond that, there are probably some places, particularly in Atlanta, that actually may pay better than the tip minimum wage. And it's helpful to know where those places are. Is any of your people, I mean, the people who've come with you to Congress, Saru, from Georgia?
Yeah, we have had restaurant owners and workers. We work with 9 to 5 in Atlanta. Stacey Abrams has been a champion of one fair wage. We've had really great people from Georgia, but the state is still a $2.13
Right.
state. Absolutely. So I just think most people don't know it. Clearly, most people don't know it's a legacy of slavery. You know, if the very strong Black community in Atlanta knew that, I think we could really mobilize people to change it. But we also need,
You're looking at a very thinly staffed operation here, I mean,
yeah.
you got a lot of the firepower right here in this chat. Nikki and Saru. Okay, but here's a good question for you guys. Maybe this is the one we'll end on if Kendra doesn't send me something else. How does one support the work of One Fair Wage? Can I apply to be a volunteer? Are there any internship possibilities, or do I just simply donate? And if they donate, where do they donate? So that's a good question for either you, Saru, or Nikki to answer. We always like questions like that.
Yes. Again, if you are able to, please still donate at www.ofwemergencyfund.org. As Saru said, we have over 200,000 people who have applied for relief. We've only been able to, we've paid 35,000 people. There's so many more to help. So if you're able to give any amount, $10, $20, it counts. Please donate.
$150, whatever you can get.
150, 200, 100,000, help us out. That's ofwemergencyfund.org. If you want to volunteer, you can also go to that same website. There's a button on there for you to volunteer. We have a volunteer manager, Brienne, who will reach out to you. But if you want an internship, I recommend just emailing me because I'd love to have a one-to-one with you and hear about your capacity and your self-interest and develop something with you that you will actually do rather than just plug you in. Or I can just plug you in. We have a lot of work too. But again, my email is nikki@onefairwage.org. I'll put it in the chat one more time. So again, that's emergencyfund.org. Go there to donate or to sign up to volunteer, or email me, nikki@onefairwage.org, if you want to talk more specifically.
There was one question which we didn't get to, which is the relationship between One Fair Wage and unions, which I suspect the relationship has gotten better if Mary Kay Henry is now on your call this coming week. So why don't you just give us they're not, everybody's not always on the same page. So maybe you could just really simply explain what the history has been and where things are moving now.
You know, everybody always asks us, are you working with unions? Why aren't you working with unions? And I guess I would really push people to flip the question. Why aren't unions taking up this issue as a priority issue? Why haven't they in the past? I mean, the fact that the largest industry is earning $2 an hour, should that not be a priority for the labor movement? And it wasn't always. We saw many instances where $15 minimum wage passed and tipped workers were carved out, left behind because they were women of color. But we've been pushing and they've been listening, and we are sisters in the movement. We keep pushing. We'll work with anybody who'll work with us. I think it's time for us as a labor movement to work together for all workers, for no worker to be left behind. And listen, I'm not calling anybody out. I'm calling us all out. I'm calling us out as well. Everybody, we need to work together in solidarity to say no worker should be left behind. So we fought for a long time just for tipped workers, until we realized tipped workers were not the only sub-minimum wage workers. People with disabilities get a sub-minimum wage. Incarcerated workers have received a sub-minimum wage of 11 cents on the dollar or less or slightly more because of the exception to the 13th Amendment that allows for slavery in the case of incarceration. And right now, with these insane wildfires in California, guess who's fighting these wildfires? It's incarcerated people, thousands of them, out fighting these fires for 11 cents an hour. And then there are youth in many states who are paid a sub-minimum wage. So we should not all only be fighting for ourselves. We need to end all sub-minimum wages in the United States of America. For God's sakes, why was there a minimum wage passed in the first place if it isn't meant for every worker in America to be earning it? Nobody should be earning less. So we all need to be working together. We are trying to work with unions. We hope that they'll work with us. And we are now also working with gig workers and incarcerated workers and people with disabilities, because we want to walk the talk. We're telling labor, work with us. So we also have to reach out to the people who have even less voice than we do.
And I just want to add that we actually had two local unions that actually supported the screening as co-sponsors. And I'm going to give them a shout out. It's Unite Here 2850 and SEIU USWW. So there are, unions that understand the importance of this struggle and the fact that if we can win this, really what this fight is about is back to the fight for 15. Really what this is all about is ending the tip minimum wage and beginning to have more and more, agreement that by the time we win a $15 an hour minimum wage for all workers, it will be so outdated, we're going to have to move to 20 or 25. That is the world that we're in. So it is going to take everybody coming together. And that's part of what Saru says in the film when we talk about the fight for 15, to make this happen. And the place where unions and One Fair Wage and the people fighting for disability rights and sort of we're all on the same page is there's only one choice. If we want to see any of these things progress forward in the next 4 years, there is really only one choice, which is for us to do a bang up job about getting out the vote. I mean, we are all depending on this at this point. And so, the work that One Fair Wage is doing and the work that all these other groups are doing, really requires that we all make a big effort in the next 2 months to get as many people as we can to the polls. Because it's less about this issue per se and more about what it is going to take for all of us to lead halfway decent lives in the next decade. Because we are seeing what happens when the wrong people are running this country. And so I don't know that we need to say anything else except a big thank you to all of the participants for being here, to the people who were on the chat listening to us. Thank you so much for attending. And think of yourselves as empowered by this to take the word forward in your community, to educate your friends. You are now all able to have a conversation about what we need to do about economic equity in this country moving forward. And we need you to be part of this struggle. So I joined late. I only got on this 3 or 4 years ago when I decided.
3 or 4 years ago.
But
But
okay,
okay, so
I think we're going to say goodbye and thank everybody for their time, their attention, their great questions. Thank you to Kendra for having facilitated us from the back end, and everybody on YouTube as well. Thank you all for being with us. Okay, I think we're saying goodbye now. Okay.